Seriously, if you have the mentality of you pull you tank, you'd better off playing World of Warcraft instead. In this video, I'm gonna go through the basics of tanking, basics rotations understanding, defensive cooldowns, types of mitigations, along with the detailed explanations about each tank's strength and weaknesses. Disclaimer as usual, all jobs are viable in all content as of now, and hopefully in the future. I sure hope PA's incident doesn't happen again. As always, I am not the most qualified person to talk about these kind of stuff, so do let me know in the comments if I'm wrong about something. So in Final Fantasy XIV, there's this thing called Enmity. You can see the Enmity list right here. A means that the person has the highest enmity, making him the main threat, and that's how boss determine which party member they will hit. And no, if there's multiple enemies, they don't share the same enmity list. You can see if you swap targets to the other enemies, and you get enmity by doing damage or healing. All tanks have these things called tank stands, which increases your enmity gain. That's why even when DPS are doing more damage than tanks, tanks always get aggro. But as you may remember, I said you get enmity by doing damage to your enemy. So even if you have your tank stance on, you won't get aggro if you don't press your buttons. Even if you press your AoE in dungeons, DPS could still steal your aggro if you don't follow up with other things like maybe pressing your range attacks or using provoke or even using your off GCDs like Flood of Shadow to do damage. So you'd better be pressing your buttons more often than how often you get some bitch hit. All tank jobs have their 1, 2, 3 and you already know that. They also have their AoE combos, and the next step after knowing your ABC is buff alignments. If you pay attention to your tank's off-global cooldowns, there are some skills that have 30-second cooldown, 60, 90, and 120. This is important to note because you want to line your OGCDs up with party buffs. And what does that mean, you ask? Party buff is just like what it sounds like. It's a party-wide buff that increases your damage. Take Battle Voice for example. It increases your crit rate for the whole party, which will increase your overall damage output of course. So the general idea, not only for playing tanks really, but every other job is to save your resources for when party buffs are up if possible, so that your heavy hitting stuff hits even harder because it's buffed by your party buffs. So if you think about it, party buffs comes out usually 5 seconds after your first mob pull, whether in a raid or a dungeon, it doesn't really matter. If you use your 30 seconds and 1 minute OGCD immediately, the 30 second one will come up in 30 seconds. And then the 60 seconds one will come up in a minute. And if you repeat the cycle, the 30 second OGCD will come up at 1:30, and then both of them will be up in 2 minutes, which is where party buffs are gonna be up again. Of course, there's stuff to consider like holding burst in ultimates for the next phases or even in dungeons. You use it early or late depending on the pack of mobs, but that is the general idea. All the tanks have defensive skills. They have different defensive skills that does different things, but they also have a few skills that are shared across all tanks. And some of those that has the purpose of reducing damage are Reprisal, Rampart, and Arm's Length. Reprisal has a 60-second cooldown and reduces 10% damage dealt by enemies. And Rampart reduces the damage you take by 20%. And Arm's Length gives you knockback immunity, but more importantly, slow enemies down by 20% when they hit you, which means they move and attack slower, giving some sort of mitigation. Not all tanks have the same amount of mitigation, and some mitigations perform better than others in certain situations. Tank mitigations are categorized based on their cooldowns. There are also types of mitigations like shields and damage reduction, but I'll get to that later. And so there are short cooldowns, which are mitigations that has less than 30-second recast time like Heart of Corundum, and we call them short tank cooldowns. 60 seconds mitigations like Reprisal and Dark Knight's exclusive 2-stack mid Oblation. 90-second mitigation like Rampart, Theory of Battle, Bulwark, and Camouflage. And lastly, 120 seconds mitigations, which every tank has. They all generally do the same thing, which is 30% damage reduction to all damage with the added effect of counter with 55 potency exclusively for Vengeance. A lot of mistakes that even non-sprouts do I see in dungeons when using tank is using their short cooldowns so late in the pull. In dungeons pulls, if you're pulling wall to wall, which is short by the way, you can actually just use your short cooldowns early and you'll have it up halfway when you're still killing the current pack you're pulling, resulting in more damage being mitigated, so you should do that. Make healer's job easier. Please. This is mostly relevant for raiders and you don't really need to know about this if you're doing casual content. If you are not interested in raiding, you can just skip to the timestamps on the screen right now. Okay? Now that only the big strong boys are here or you're just curious, let's talk about different types of mitigations. There's a really good video about Zeno explaining this and his link is in the description. And this is just basically a summary of what he said in that video. There are 3 types of mitigations, which are healing, shielding, and mitigation. So, let's say you have 100k HP in this scenario, and you're currently fighting a boss. He's about to hit you for 100k damage. No matter how much the healers use Cure 3 on you, you can't survive the tank busters, because healing can only give you HP equal as to your max HP. But if you use a TBN for example, well, you'd now have 100k health and 25k shield. You would survive obviously. But now, here's the interesting part. What if the boss is gonna hit you 7 times for 25k? You pop TBN, you'd end up with 100k health and 25k shield. You'd die. But what if you pop Rampart instead? Well, you'd still die, but that's besides the point. You will be mitigating 35k damage instead of 25k TBN gate. The point is mitigation scales to the enemy attack instead of your HP pool. TBN gives shield based on your max HP while Rampart mitigates 20% from incoming damage. But there's also a catch with mitigation. Percent mitigation stacks multiplicatively instead of additively. So taken straight from FF14's example, and I quote, having 120%, 130%, and 210% mitigations result in 0.8 times 0.7 times 0.9 times 0.9 equals to 0.45 times damage taken for a damage reduction of 55% instead of 20 plus 30 plus 10 plus 10. So in most cases, shields scale the best with mitigation. Healing, like Zeno says, is the most useful when you don't die. Like, let's take that previous example where the tank busters hit for 7 times for 25k. Well, after the initial hit, you will be able to heal up in between the tank busters. And healing won't work because obviously you're healing between the tank busters. You'd heal the tanks that are already not at max HP. So, to go over the things that we just talked about, shielding is the best for single target tank busters because it scales based on your HP instead of the incoming damage, but worse than mitigation on multi-hit. Because multi-hit tank busters usually hit a lot harder than single target tank busters. Sure, the damage is over time and the first hit will not hit as hard as single target tank busters, but over time it will do more damage overall and shield will have diminishing returns because the higher the damage is, the better mitigation scales and healing shines when you don't die or when you can heal in between incoming damage. Man fucking mode, baby! Where's the strongest tanks for dungeons and the easiest tank job to pick up? Warrior's only downside I can think of is Warrior only have 1 shareable mitigation. Paladin have 100 oath gauge that you could use for 2 interventions. Dark Knight has 1 CBN and 2 oblations. Even Gunbreaker, the worst tank in the game, has Heart of Conundrum and 2 Auroras. Even though it's really strong, it shares a cooldown with your Bloodwedding, so in some situation where you need Bloodwedding to survive, you can really give them to party members that need them. Warrior has the most consistent damage output in and outside of 2-minute burst window. There are jobs like Gunbreaker that rely a lot on limited number of skills as their source of main damage, so it's a lot more punishing when you land your resources outside of No Mercy window buff, or drift to the point where your double down lands without the party white buffs. Of course you want to try and land all of Warrior's hardening skills on party white buffs too, like triple Infuriate on 2-minute burst windows, but if you don't, it's a lot less punishing. Remember I mentioned that Warrior is the best tank for dungeons. It's because on level 56 you get Raw Infusion that gets upgraded to Blood Wedding at level 82. On top of 10% Raw Mid, Infusion also gives you healing when you hit the enemy. So when you use your AoE attack, you basically get full health for free. Do you remember how I explained that you want to try and rotate your short tank cooldown so you can use 2 in a pool or even more if the mob dies slow? This is especially true for Warrior, so healers don't need to spend a single drop of MP to heal you. Warrior is the easiest tank to pick up, it's not even close, both in casual content and in endgame content like Savage and Ultimates as well. Because unlike jobs like Gunbreaker that has to fit all of their bursts in their No Mercy window, same with Paladin that has Fight or Flight, or Dark Knight that has to manage their blood gauge for Living Shadow, Warrior just press Inner Release and Fell Cleave. Warrior also has one of the best invuln because of its short recast duration. Even though it doesn't have crazy effects like Dark Knight that can heal itself or Paladin, in some scenarios, Warrior could fit in more invuln in a fight so that the healers don't need to heal them in heavy hitting tank busters or other scenarios, especially in long fights like DSR. I'm a Gunbreaker hater, man. In my opinion, Gunbreaker is the hardest tank job. It's not even close. Like, imagine Dark Knight, but you actually have to think. One of the main reasons I hate Gunbreaker because Gunbreaker's big damage on burst window relies entirely on one skill that hits one time. I mean, don't get me wrong, Living Shadow is also just one skill, but your shadow does damage over time and more often than not, the damage variance even out. For Gunbreaker, however, if you don't crit your double down, you just thrive. For reference, in DSR, if double down crits, you'd do 80k. If you don't crit, guess how much damage you'd do? 24k! Even in casual content, I think Gunbreaker's the hardest tank job to pick up just because you have to double weave so much. And in endgame content, the learning curve is so steep. The amount of optimization that you'd have to do just to do 2% more damage than Warrior is just so depressing. That's why you see the damage variance on Gunbreaker is the highest on almost all the raid, because they're just hyper optimization that you can do that will change the whole rotation timeline of the fight. That combined with double down crit variance is just a nightmare in my opinion. One of the few things that I like about Gunbreaker is it has the coolest short cooldown in my opinion. It's just like Holy Sheltron, but instead of regen, it has a heal effect that will pop when your HP drops below 50% or when the effects run out. I might be wrong here, but based on kill time, Gunbreaker and Dark Knight does the most damage out of all the tanks combination. Which is why speed kill teams uses both Gunbreaker and Dark Knight. But then when I was browsing FF logs, I saw this graph. Now, I'm not really sure about this, but this doesn't really indicate that Gunbreaker is dealing less damage than other classes. According to some people, the reason why Gunbreaker is not doing as much damage anymore is because the kill time is too fast nowadays. Edgy, goofy particle effects, big sword, and probably has daddy issues. Dark Knight relies on blood gauge that caps at 100, which are used for skills that has higher potency than normal Dark Knight skills. You get them by performing Soul Eater or using an offensive skill while having Blood Weapon up. It also relies on a passive buff called Dark Side, which is a buff timer that caps at 1 minute, and it buffs your damage by 10%. You get that buff by using either Flat of Shadow or Edge of Shadow. Dark Knight also has the most mitigations and the strongest mitigations for single hit tank busters with the Blackest Night. That's why Dark Knight is so good at some ultimate raids like P6 DSR. Because you have a 20% magic mitigation that has a 60-second cooldown, it makes Phase 6 so comfy because you'd have Dark Mind for both Hallowed Wings. Dark Knight has the strongest 2-minute burst as far as I'm concerned. Living Shadow is crazy. And 2 stacks of Shadowbringers combined with everything else makes Dark Knight just better than other tanks in 2 minutes windows. But at the same time, Dark Knight has probably one of the worst invuln depending on the situation. Dark Knight's invuln basically makes you unkillable for 10 seconds. If your HP drops below 1, the buff will change from Living Dead to Walking Dead. It will refresh the buff timer, but if you're not fully healed by the time the buff runs out, you just die. You do lifesteal when you attack, but it's really bad when there's nothing to hit, because healer then would have to heal you to full to remove that debuff. In casual content, this is rarely a problem, but in some ultimates like Uwu's second phase on the second tank busters, or Cauterize, you'd have nothing to hit and you're putting a lot of strain to the healers. The other downside for Dark Knight is Dark Knight doesn't have party mitigations until level 72. So if you're running ultimates that are synced to level 70 like Uwu and Yukop, the healing check would be much higher compared to having other jobs like Warrior that has Shake or Paladin that has Passage and Divine Veil. Honestly, I respect you Paladin mains. Out all of the jobs, you chose the one that uses Sword and Shield. Actually based as fuck. Paladin is the only tank that doesn't use job gauge to do damage, instead to use their mitigation. Shieldtron and Intervention, both of them uses 50 oath gauge, so you can technically stores up to 2. Paladin is also the only job that has 3 party mitigations, which are Divine Veil, Passage of Arms, and Reprisal of course. The 100 oath gauge also means you can mit yourself and someone else like your co-tank, but Paladin has the weakest self-mitigation as far as I'm concerned. I don't think it's a really crazy take to say that Holy Shieldtron is the weakest short mitigation in the game, arguably with it scaling better than TBN on multi-hit tank busters, but it's really strong at the same time because it has 2 charges, and in situations like P6 DSR where you need to take Hallowed Wings 2 and Warm's Breath 2 tank busters back to back, Shieldtron is really strong, especially because other classes like Warrior wouldn't have their Blood Wedding up for both. Dark Knight will have their CBN up for both, but that's besides the point. Paladin has their standard 30% reduction and Bulwark, and I think that's worse than Camouflage. Another unique trait of Paladin is they have Holy Spirit. They can be casted for free and instant when you do your 1-2-3 combo or AoE combo. Even when you need to cast it, it's honestly really cool because you could cast Holy Spirit when you're forced to take downtime spot. Another thing that Paladin can do is heal. It's a decent failsafe and a pretty good ability to have when you're progging a fight. This class is very easy to pick up since just like Warrior, with this class you can just press your OGCD and press skills that lights up. Unlike Warrior and Dark Knight that has Dark Sight and Surging Tempest that actively boost your attack as long as you have the buff up, Paladin has a skill that raises your attack like No Mercy from Gunbreaker, Fight or Flight. Same concept as Gunbreaker though, you'd want to use your Fight or Flight usually on 1 minute burst window and on party buff, and you would line up all of your resources for that short burst phase. So, after all of this information, which tank job you should choose? Well, just play whatever you want. I know, very original and creative answer, but they're true. Unless you're doing world prog or the game had job imbalance like how P8S was literally unclearable unless you have Gunbreaker and Dark Knight. Just kidding, the only playable tank is actually Warrior.